Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name's Belle Donati. I'm a news anchor and an arts presenter. Tonight, we are diving into the life of a writer whose cerebral gymnastics and happiness, those are the words of an old friend, the American film director Mike Nichols, belie a depth of emotion and of ideas, and an increasing interest in his own complicated identity. The life, of course, is that of Sir Tom Stoppard, and the biographer who has taken on the challenge is Professor Dame Hermione Lee. Welcome. I'd like Hermione to start, if you don't mind, if you could take us back to 2013 when you were attending a party thrown by Tom Stoppard. There were stilt walkers, bands, jugglers all around. It was here that the project began. Can you just explain to us how that happened?
Yes, thank you. It's very nice to be here and to talk to you. Yes, you describe a kind of charivari of sort of delightful events, and the whole thing was rather sort of joyous and not a serious event. And in the middle of this joyous, gregarious event, he asked me rather suddenly if I would write his biography. We had had a conversation just before that at Oxford. I know him slightly. I didn't know him well, but I knew him socially. We'd had a conversation about biography, and we were sort of joking about biography. So he may have taken that as his lead. And yes, and he asked me if I would do it, and I immediately said yes, without pausing for thought, because you would, wouldn't you? I mean, you wouldn't pass up an opportunity like that. And then I immediately thought, my goodness, what have I taken on? This is quite a challenge.
Well, certainly quite a challenge, because unlike your previous subjects, he is still alive, which I imagine must change things a lot. How has that altered the way you approached this?
Yes, happily he's still alive, and long may he live. And it's true that my previous subjects have all been safely dead. So clearly you've got advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that if you are lucky, as I was, you have an extraordinary privileged access to your biographical subject. And unlike Samuel Beckett, who said to his first biographer, "I will neither help nor hinder," Stoppard did help and he didn't hinder. So he made himself available for quite a number of quite long conversations, some of them lasting over a whole weekend, over a period of about 6 years. He gave me some remarkable materials to look at, which I probably would not have had access to, such as the weekly letters that he wrote to his mother between about 1948 and 1996, when she died. And that's a quite extraordinary source. Also a journal that he wrote for his youngest son, Ed, when Ed was born, which was a very revealing document. So there was that, and there was also the fact that he introduced me to a lot of people that I could talk to, and I also found my way to other people. And there is also, I must say, a very well archived mass of papers in the Harry Ransom Center at Austin, Texas. So there was that to look at as well. And I also had the extraordinary good fortune to sit in on some rehearsals where Stoppard was working with either an old play or a new play. One of the disadvantages, I should add as a pendant to this, is that the people you're talking to about him know that what they are saying is probably going to appear in your book and that he will read it. So you have to be aware of that in the back of their minds when they're telling you what they think about him.
That's you make a mention of that actually towards the end of the book. There's this wonderful, the last couple of pages, wonderful bit where you sort of appear on stage, as it were, having been removed as an authorial voice thus far, and you suddenly appear and you talk about how you became involved in the project. And then, of course, exactly, you say those people you would have spoken to, they want to praise him because they know he'll read it. Was that ever a concern that you shared as the biographer, knowing that he would read it? Did you ever think, oh God, I can't write that, he's going to read that?
Yes, I'm sure that was in my mind sometimes. Fortunately, because he's a very decent human being, there weren't many things that were sort of cringe-makingly horrible to have to write about, though there were obviously some difficult and problematic periods in his life, which I tried to deal with as factually and as straightforwardly as I could, given what materials I had. I think really when you're writing biography, you have to behave as if everyone is dead. Um, otherwise you're going to constantly be pulling your pen off the metaphorical page, as it were. I think you've got to have a certain degree of ruthlessness and a certain degree of impersonality about the whole business. So I don't think I was setting out to please. At least I hope that I wasn't.
Has he told you what he thinks about it?
We had a very interesting working session, part of the deal between us, and it was a properly contractual, negotiated business relationship, which was that I was to get the book in on time, as it were, and he was to give me access and what materials he could provide me with. And he also undertook to read it for matters of fact, which raises, of course, all kinds of nice questions about biography. What is a matter of fact? And he did indeed go through it. We had a day where I rather nervously arrived, and I saw about 200 yellow post-it notes stuck into the typescript. And we literally went through as he turned the pages and said, I think that's wrong, I'm not sure that's right, and so on. But after he'd done that, I mean, it was interesting to me because I was expecting some things that were going to be difficult for him. For instance, his very first romance with the young woman he fell in love with at Bristol when he was in his teens, Isabel, who recently died. He wrote some very sweet and very gauche love letters to her, which she had kept and showed me. And so I quoted some of them. And I was expecting him to recoil from those passages and say, oh, do I have to have this? This is so embarrassing. But he passed over them, rather to my surprise. And then later, he said to me that when he'd been reading the book for matters of fact, it was almost as if he hadn't read it at all. And I think he put up a kind of screen between himself and the book. There were, he's not a person who enjoys self-exposure, self-revelation. I think he slightly held it at arm's length in his mind. So he now says jokingly to me that it's as if he's never read it.
That's also fascinating because he was obviously the one who requested the biography to be written, and yet to be able to put that screen up. I don't know if you have a sense of why he might have asked for the biography to be written. There was, given as well how disdainful a lot of his characters are about biography as an art form.
Indeed.
Why he might have asked that. The only thing I could come up with was perhaps he might have had more of an element of control alive than he would have done after he was no longer around. Do you think that's possible?
Well, except that he didn't. I mean, unless there were many secrets and dark places that he wasn't revealing to me, I didn't get the feeling that he was trying to control it at all. He certainly at no point said, how are you doing this, and how are you writing that? Not at all. And as I say, when he read it, he literally only did remark on, dates that he thought I'd got wrong, things like that. Yes, you can't work on a life of Tom Stoppard without being aware that there are some pretty gruesome characters in his plays who are either literary editors or biographers, like the frightful Bernard in Arcadia, who gets everything wrong, all of that. And Oscar Wilde is very rude about biography in The Invention of Love, where Stoppard has Wilde say very Wildean things about how hopeless biography is. I do think I have a sense of why he wanted someone to do it then. He had been approached quite a bit by would-be biographers, and I think this is a bit of a nuisance to him. There had been, in fact, a biography of him a few years back by a Canadian academic, which was perfectly fine, but he hadn't had access or permission, really, so he just got on with it. And I think Stoppard quite wanted to sort that out. He was turning 80, he was getting married again, he was moving house, he was sorting out a lot of papers. And I think it was partly a sort of process of tidying up, actually, as much as anything.
And it's interesting because, of course, the access that you had to a lot of the sources that you mentioned earlier was because it was the authorized biography. I wonder if as an authorized biography about a person who is living, there's almost a sense in which you as the biographer slightly shift in role and become much more closely aligned to your subject, almost as though you're halfway between an autobiography and a biography, because there is that collaboration. I mean, I'm also thinking about the voice that you use at times where it's halfway between your voice and Stoppard's voice. There's parts where you're not quoting, but you say, for example, it was much easier and much more exciting to start out as a playwright than as a novelist. And that's obviously in Stoppard's voice, but it's not quoted.
Well,
And I
you're very shrewd to notice that. And though I slightly resist the first part of the question, I actually hate the word authorized. It sounds so sort of monumental and rigid. And I never quite thought of it like that. I suppose permitted rather than authorized might have been a better word. I certainly don't think I felt differently about the way I approached it in that respect than writing about Edith Wharton or Virginia Woolf or Penelope Fitzgerald. I felt it was the same task really, which was to understand this writer and this person as well as could possibly be, and to put them in the context of their world and their life and their friends. I mean, that's and to understand how their mind worked and how they changed. So I think that's always been the task. That thing about sort of free indirect speech, as it were, did actually come out of a very interesting moment early on in my conversations with him. He gave me a kind of clue for it, really. He said he's done 1,000,000 trillion interviews. And he was talking to me and I was recording what he said. And he said, you're not going to quote this, are you? Because otherwise it's going to be like just like a collection of interviews for a newspaper. And I went away and I thought, yeah, he's right about that. And actually what I need to do is say what he feels and say what he said and say what he said to me, but without all the time saying, Tom Stoppard said to me on the morning of September the 19th, 2015, so I did actually try and ventriloquize him a bit. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And I guess you were talking there about how you didn't approach it any differently from your previous subjects, from Virginia Woolf, from Edith Wharton, etc. With those biographies, you'd taken on the sort of conceit of those biographies to an extent is within the style of the subject that you're writing about. With Tom Stoppard, did you feel it was different? He's not a novelist. I mean, he's not a woman. I don't know if that made any difference at all. But he's unlike the others that you've written about before. Was there a sense that actually trying to pin down his style or trying to find that style and write in that way or use that somehow was difficult?
Yes. I don't think I've tried to write in the style of my subjects. It would be a nightmare if you try to write a biography of Virginia Woolf in the style of Virginia Woolf. But I suppose in response to what you're saying, I have always tried to get their voices very much into my narrative. I want them to speak for themselves. And so I was also trying to do, that's partly why some of my books are quite long, because I like to quote a lot and to give a big sense of what the subject's work is and to talk about the work. And yes, the big difference was the fact I'd only ever written about novelists before. And I'm not a sort of fully paid up theatre person, although I love the theatre and have always been very interested in it. But there's something about writing about plays as opposed to writing about fiction in a biography, which is very different because you have so many voices. And one of the things that's really interesting and fascinating about Stoppard's work is that he often gives the best line to the opposition. That, he's like Turgenev in The Coast of Utopia, who says, I take every possible position. He's never going to be pinned down to one position. Stoppard did an early spoof documentary about himself in the 70s when he became famous, which was called Tom Stoppard Doesn't Know, in which he refused to answer any sort of, what do you think about Vietnam? These sorts of things. I don't know. And that's, although he does have very strong moral and political positions on a number of things, that sense of being like a chameleon is partly what makes him such a wonderful playwright, I think. And so that was a harder thing to get hold of in the book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how did you approach that difference between novels, which was a world you were very comfortable with, very familiar with, and then plays, a completely different world?
I think I tried to, although I treat the plays as literature, as text, and I think it may have been one of the reasons he asked me to do it that he knew I was a literary biographer and would think a lot about the work and wouldn't just do the social stuff, as it were. But I think I tried to take a leaf out of his book where he talks a lot in all through his life about theatre being an event, not a text. And so I'm very fascinated by the translation or the transition that takes place between him sitting at his desk, sometimes, for a long time, burnishing these sentences. He's a brilliant wordsmith, making every line as sharp or as funny or as meaningful or as absolutely essential as it could be. And then going into the rehearsal room where you have all these different interests of the director and the designer and the actors and the lighting and so on, where he will become, I mean, I think quite unusually among playwrights, very, very receptive to suggestions that people are making or problems that are arising day by day in rehearsal. So he is a pragmatist of the theatre. He'll change things, and I've seen him do that in rehearsal. It's very fascinating to watch. He doesn't come between the director and the cast, but when asked, he will say, well, why don't we put in an extra line to give you time to get from the bed to the door as well. So, and in conversation with him, I often thought I would be talking about high matters of intellectual philosophy. And I found we were talking about how he'd managed to cut 3.5 minutes off the second scene of the first act of a play in order to get the running time down. He's a very practical, pragmatic figure, and I try to get a sense of that in the book.
Yeah, well, you do. And I think there's also a sense in which he really understands the nuts and the bolts, the physicality of drama. It's not simply, for him, the text itself is very much a living text. It doesn't finish once he's put down the pen. It continues as the rehearsals, as you say, as the rehearsals start, and he's constantly tinkering with the text, isn't he?
So Faber, his publishers, have frequently put out a first edition of a play, and by the time that's come out in the bookshop, it's changed. So they will know that they quite often will have to do a quite rapid second edition of the play, which will incorporate the changes that have gone on being made right to the last moment. God, and afterwards in the previews,
Yes, and presumably when they have revivals as well, do they start being tinkered again?
Well, there's a very rather moving current example of that, and I'm just about to go and see it again, of Leopoldstadt, which of course went dark after a number of performances last spring in March, April 2020, and has come back now that theatres have reopened, and it's come back with, I think, 20 minutes gone because they didn't want to have an interval. This is a good example of the practical needs of theatre. And the reason they didn't want to have an interval was because they want to keep the theatres as safe as possible, because of the pandemic. And so I haven't seen the new version yet, and I am absolutely gripped to see what he will have cut and how he will have done that with the director, Patrick Marmer.
Well, I wish I'd seen the previous. I saw the new one on last Friday, and it was fantastic. It was absolutely brilliant. But I wish I'd seen to compare the previous version, obviously. So you'll have to tell me.
You can read it.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. Exactly. Although it will have changed countless times since then. I'd love to ask you. Biography is obviously about life, but it's also about the work. But there's that sort of tension that the interest in the life comes because of the work. When you approach a biography of someone like Tom Stoppard, how do you hold that tension in the way that you're writing? Because I guess there'll be people who come to him through the work uniquely, and then with someone like Tom Stoppard, there'll be people who come to him through the tabloid pages and the society pages. How do you balance those two?
That's a very good question, and there is many a time over the last few years where you will have found me in my writing shed, banging my head against the wall of the shed, asking myself precisely that question. I mean, that's the difficult thing. That's a really difficult part, I think. I see it as sort of a double book in a way, this book, which is that if you want to read in depth about these plays, and not just the plays, but every single thing he ever wrote, his radio stuff and his film scripts, his television adaptation of Ford Madox Ford and so on. It's all there, quite sort of at length, really. I really wanted to get into the plays and what they're about, what they mean, what they do, and how they work, and indeed the different productions of them and so on. So it's endless. So I've tried to do that, and at the same time, of course, I needed to tell the story of this remarkable human being with an extraordinary history, with an enormous range of friends and colleagues and acquaintances and people he's worked with, an extraordinary reader who brings to his work a vast amount of knowledge and reading, and someone who is also extremely gregarious and social, has had quite a full and dramatic personal life and lots of friends, hence those parties we started by talking about. And I thought it was important to get all that in, and also his very strong support, political support for historically people who have been oppressed by uh, Soviet regimes, communist regimes in Eastern Europe. More recently, he did a lot of work for the Belarus free theatre people. So that strand of his life, which is the opposite, as it were, of going to the palace to get the ON. I mean, there's many different strands to this life, and I wanted all that to be in there as well.
And I think, as you say, that's why it needed to be so huge, is that it has to pull all those strands together. You need to feel, and I love that you have full analyses of a lot of the plays, a lot of the text.
Thank you.
Therefore, you do get those both sides. You see him as the artist and you see him as the man,
But I feel that if you didn't feel like reading a whole lot about the coast of Utopia or rock and roll, you could just skip those bits.
Very true, very true. Not that I would recommend that ever. How do you end a biography about a living person? Because of course there's a natural end when someone is no longer around, but how do you end that?
Yes. I asked the question at the end of the book. As you say, I come into the book off from being in the wings, as it were, and I asked the question because I'm very fascinated by the mystery of life stories. I'm very interested in the things that can't be told and the things that you will never manage to pin down. There is no such thing, just as I don't much like the word authorized, I loathe the word definitive, because there is no such thing as a definitive biography. There will always be things that escape you. And there is also the person themselves, the actual physical and spiritual and emotional presence of that person, which you try to describe, but which is, it's a different thing from a book. So I actually decided to end it with a description of a production of The Tempest, which Stoppard himself has quite often talked and written about, where it's actually in Worcester College, Oxford, where I think you were a student, and they put a duckboard under the lake in the garden at Worcester College, and the night is falling, and Ariel gets his freedom, says goodbye to Prospero, and runs across the water in the gathering dark, splish splosh across the lake, and as he disappears into the darkness on the other side of the lake, an enormous firework goes up. And Stoppard says, when he tells his story, and if you go to the play and look at what it says exit Ariel. And he tells his story in order to show that theatre is an event and not a text.
Absolutely, and that it's the sum of all of its parts, not simply the text or the director or the actors. It's the sum of all of that.
But, yes, and I wanted to see him both as Prospero, the sort of mastermind and the spellbinder, and also as Ariel, kind of not exactly flighty, but glittering, elusive, brilliant, vanishing creature.
It's a wonderful, wonderful ending, and in his own words, which is the joy is when you've come on and then you depart again, and you actually say, our ways will part, and then he takes it away and finishes that book. But I was also interested because the sort of last chapter, as it were, the last couple of chapters, were about Leopoldstadt, which was the play. I mean, how did that interrupt? I'm not sure where in the timeline of you writing this came, but had you always planned? I imagine when you started, you hadn't planned. You didn't know that
No, not at all. No, it's a very good question, and I don't know if you want me to go back into, as it were, the history that eventually led to Leopoldstadt, but and we can certainly do that if you like. But for me, I had thought that a good place to stop would be his 80th birthday. I thought that would be a neat place to stop in 2007. And sorry, 2017. And I had written that. I'd written that as the ending, really. And then it became apparent to me that he was writing another play. And you started by asking me, what are the problems about writing about a living subject, especially one as prolific as Tom Stoppard? That is one of the problems, that they go on writing plays. You know, I sort of thought, couldn't you stop? But actually, that would have been a great pity. So yes, I had to tell Faber that they were going to have to leave some blank pages open, even though they'd got the typescript, so that I would be able to fill in the bit about Leopoldstadt at the end. And it, in fact, makes an extraordinary ending to the book, because in a way it takes his life full circle.
Yeah, I agree. It feels very much. I mean, I know he resists autobiographical readings into his works, but would it be fair to say that that is the most autobiographical of his plays?
Well, people have said this, and to a degree it's true. I mean, there have been actually marked moments of autobiography, for instance, in a play called Rock and Roll in 2006, where there was a Czech character called Jan, whose original name in the script was to be Thomas. And so the Stoppard, it's well known, the story that the Stoppard family, who Eugen Streusler was the name of his father, who was a Jewish Czech doctor in Zlín. And the family, the mother and father and the two little boys, left Zlín when the Nazis came to Czechoslovakia and went to Singapore. And then the Japanese invaded Singapore, and his father was killed, and his mother took her little boys in a terrible journey, ending up in India, where she ran a shoe shop because they'd been working for the butcher shoe industry in Zlín. And she then remarried an English major called Ken Stoppard, and took her boys to safety in England when Stoppard was 8. And at that point, he said, I put on Englishness like a coat. And that journey, and the fact that he didn't go back to Czechoslovakia under communism, that he escaped the Nazis, that he escaped from being killed by the Japanese, led him to think of his life as a charmed life. His mother was very secretive and silent about her past, and although he knew perfectly well that his father was Jewish, because that's why they left, and he sort of knew that his mother was Jewish, but he never really got a proper answer to that question. And because she didn't want to talk about the past, he never really asked her. And it wasn't until he was in his 50s that he began to find out about his family history, and that he found out, in fact, from a cousin, that many members of his family had been killed in the Holocaust, many members of his mother's family. And he has a conversation with his cousin where he says to her, were we Jewish? And she said, of course we were Jewish. This is the family. And she draws the family tree for him on a napkin in the restaurant where they are. And she tells him what happened to them all. Auschwitz, Terezin. That conversation, which took place in 93, becomes a scene in the last act of Leopoldstadt in 2020. And it takes that amount of time for him to start thinking, particularly after his mother died in 96, and then long after that, about what it really meant to have a charmed life, what it mean in relation to the people who hadn't had a charmed life. So although I think there's a lot of sense of, you started by talking about him as a moving as well as a brilliantly funny playwright, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think all through his plays there's a sense of exile, bewilderment, homelessness. I mean, you get it in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Why are we here? What are we doing? How can we get home? You know, it comes into full flood in Leopoldstadt, and you're quite right that the last scene, in which there is a rather blithe 20-something young Englishman who has forgotten his Viennese Jewish past, his childhood, and is finally, it comes home to him and he's reminded of it in a deeply moving scene. But yes, that's a version of his own story.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about his identity, and we talk about, of course, the Jewishness that he came to very late, and that sort of drip fed, as you say, he understood that his father had been Jewish, but not that his mother had been Jewish until into his 50s. There's also, of course, his Czech identity, which was a little less buried, as it were. But it was still very complicated, that relationship with his Czech roots. I think he used to call himself a bounced Czech. That's one of the sort of famous lines. And earlier on in the book, you talk about, his reaction to the Prague Spring in 1968. How did that relationship evolve? Because he was fairly apolitical sort of in the early years, and then suddenly, as he grew in understanding of his own Czech roots, it seems as though he wanted to be more political in that sense.
No, that's right, and there was a sort of sense of him with Rosencrantz and the Real Inspector Hound and Jumpers and Travesties, that this was an absolutely brilliant, though heartless, player with words and player with dramatic situations. And Ken Tynan, who'd been a famous legendary drama critic and the dramaturge at the National, who in fact made possible the putting on of Rosencrantz at the National Theatre, wrote a rather derogatory piece about Stoppard in 1977, which made him out to be a sort of dandyish, apolitical figure, by which time that was definitely no longer the case, in that he had become involved in the 70s with, for instance, the Soviet refuseniks, the Soviet Jews who were trying to get out of Soviet Russia, and also with the political prisoners, many of whom were sent to mental hospitals under the Soviet regime. And he became involved with the Prague Spring and Charter 77, and particularly with Václav Havel, who, even though Havel's English wasn't very good and Tom Stoppard does not speak Czech, they really bonded. And in a way, Havel, for many years, I think, was a sort of alter ego for Tom Stoppard. I think he frequently asked himself, and I know he did because it's in the journals that he lent me. There's a long quote where he says, Havel's just been arrested and maybe in prison for years. He is not a person whose mother fled from, got away from that country. He's a playwright like me. What would I do if I were in that situation? And he's absolutely haunted, I think, by that sense of an alternative life. And he has, I think, been extremely committed to the cause of such people in such situations, and you see it in his work with PEN and Index on Censorship and Amnesty, and as I said, more recently with the Belarus Free Theatre. It also went along, interestingly, with what in some circles is thought of as a sort of right-wing establishment agenda. That is, understandably, given his history and his background, he didn't have any sympathy with the left-wing movements of, the UK in the 70s, late 60s and 70s. He thought that to complain about, British rule as a form of fascism was a sort of frivolous thing to do, given, what's going on in other countries. He was very enthusiastic about Thatcher in the 80s. He was very much opposed to the print unions, for instance, and he wrote a play to that effect called Night and Day. This did not make him popular, for instance, at the Royal Court Theatre, where one member of the Royal Court Theatre at one point said, our mission in life is not to put on a play by Tom Stoppard. So there was all that, and that's an interesting history. But I don't think calling him a right-wing playwright gets near what he's about, actually. He is, if you see or read The Coast of Utopia, there's a big argument there about liberalism, the penalties of liberalism, the difficulties of liberalism. He's very influenced by Isaiah Berlin in this respect, the philosopher who wrote a lot about liberalism and pluralism. But he's also very much against the concept of a utopia for which millions of people have got to be sacrificed.
I mean, I think I would agree that the idea of trying to apply left-right political definitions to him almost it just doesn't it's not relevant almost to him because his
well, some people see him in that light, and I think one mustn't just I've tried to take that on board when thinking about him, but it doesn't quite work. It's not the right terminology. There's certainly no doubt but that he has a strong passion, even now a nostalgic passion, for England, English habits, English traditions, what he thinks of as English democracy and free speech, but he sees it as under threat. He's not complacent about it. And in fact, there's a speech, and you'll have noticed in the last act of Leopoldstadt, where the young Englishman makes a speech to that effect, saying, "Oh, these are the things I'm proud of, the royal family and Shakespeare," and the audience laughs. The audience laughs, and he knew the audience was going to laugh.
And did he want the audience to laugh?
I said, "Did you know the audience was going to laugh at that speech?" He said, "Yes, alas."
It's interesting because when I watched that, there was a hesitation between Leo, that character, saying, "I'm proud to be English," and there was a pause between him saying that and then listing the reasons why. "I'm proud to be English because," and there was a big pause there before he said fair play, parliament, freedom of everything, which was wonderfully vague. And that, for me, that pause felt like a criticism. But it sounds from what you're saying, actually, that was not intentional, that it was actually meant utterly at face value. But I read into it, and this is my bias, I guess, I read into it a hesitation there saying, "I'm proud to be English," and then the hesitation and the pause, almost asking the question, "But why?" In today's age, but why?
Yeah, I think if you read what he's been writing lately, sort of outside his plays, as it were, there was a very interesting pen pinter. When he won the Pen Pinter Prize in 2013, he wrote a lecture called Circumspice, which I quote at some length in the book, which is really about this, which is saying all the things that I absolutely idealized when I first came here. I'm worried that we're losing those things.
Did he ever talk to you about the sort of, I guess, the change when he says he's worried about losing those ideals, those things that he loves about Englishness? Did he talk about things like anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, those kind of movements? Were those things that worried him at the time?
Yeah, it's a good question, and strangely not. And I think when he's been asked this question, when Leopoldstadt came out, I think quite a few interviewers said, "Gosh, this is pretty relevant in that we're getting some, evidence of anti-Semitism, undoubted evidence of anti-Semitism in this country." He didn't make that link. He didn't tie it in, I don't think, at all. I mean, I may be speaking out of turn here because I can't speak for him, but I don't think he wrote this play as a sort of parable about what's going on now. But certainly when Leo says to Nathan, who's been in a concentration camp and is back in Vienna after the war in 1955, in the last scene in the play, when he says, "Oh, it couldn't happen again," that's a tremendous warning note in the play, I think.
It's interesting because his relationship to his past feels like something that at the beginning, I mean, it out of a sort of almost 900-page book, it takes up 40 pages, that his childhood, and it is this incredible, I mean, on any standard it's an incredible childhood, as you've described, the sort of uprooting twice, the death of a father, the war, the Nazis. I mean, it was really a very extraordinary childhood, and yet the sort of the gloss, not the gloss, it was so speedily got through in the book, and I wonder if that is almost an echo of the way that he felt about that past for a long time, that it was those sort of first 8 years, and I know there's that line in Leopoldstadt, isn't there? No one is born 8, but those first, I don't know how many years for him. Let's say you'll have to tell me. I can't remember how many years it would be, but until he becomes an English boy.
Yeah, he actually, very early on in our conversations, he said to me, "You'll find I've had a very exciting life up to the age of 8." That was very funny, and I know what you mean. So yes, it does rush along, that passage, partly because it did rush along. I mean,
Yes.
it was extremely, extremely rapid and dramatic 8 years, some of which he wasn't conscious of himself, obviously, until he was about 3 or 4. I tried to sort of pin down his earliest memory. Um, but I very much wanted the book to rush at you in that way, so that you felt you were on this helter skelter of fate, absolutely, from the first page onwards. And then I wanted the childhood to keep on coming back, through the book, as it does in different ways, all through to the very end.
And there's definitely a sense of that. And there's a sense of this childhood becoming an ever growing presence as he gets older and as he uncovers more and more about it.
There's another thing to say about that, I think, which as you're talking, I'm just sort of reminded of, which is that he's terribly good on and interested in the vulnerability of children. And there will often be a small boy uh, in a play, Hapgood, Every Good Boy Deserves Favour, Professional Foul. You will get a vulnerable small boy who not only represents the kind of injury that can be done to people, um, through cruelty and carelessness and tyranny, but also represents a form of truth. Um, the political prisoner in Every Good Boy writes a poem to his son Sasha, which has the line, um, "To thine own self be true. 1 and 1 is always 2." And for the child, 1 and 1 is always 2. And that's deep at the heart, I think, of what Stoppard feels about what matters, what's valuable in life. And also, he had 4 sons, and he brought up 4 sons. And he loved bringing up the sons. And there's lots in the journal about the funny things that the boys have said when they're little, and the sort of the way they behave. And you can see he's a really attentive, loving, interested father. And he said, when one of his boys is about 10, he writes down and says, I seem to keep putting a 10-year-old boy in my plays. He sort of can't help himself. That's a good side of the work, I think, and the life.
Yeah, and he was also, you write, his mother's favourite, and we've spoken a little bit about his relationship with his mother that was sort of predicated a little bit on her protective silence about the past. But I wonder if you felt that his relationship with father figures, and there were 2 in his life, obviously the father that he doesn't remember, and then the stepfather who sort of complicated relationship with. I wonder if you think that relationship with those father figures has any bearing on either the work or the life later.
Yes, I'm not very good at psychoanalyzing my subjects, because I'm not a psychoanalyst, and I don't really believe in doing that, actually. But it's interesting and obvious that someone who loses their father before they can remember him, um, is probably going to is likely to forge their way for themselves in some way, as he did from a very young age, because there isn't that, there is no paternal thing to fight against. I mean, the story of how he comes finally to feel the grief of the loss of his father is a very remarkable story, where when his mother tells him when they're in India that his father's died, and she's very anxious as to how they're going to respond, and he doesn't seem to be responding very much at all. In fact, he doesn't feel very much at all, because he can't remember his father much, if at all. And then decades later, he meets a woman who was at the hospital where his father worked, and she cut her hand, and she told him that Dr. Streusler had sewn up the wound in her hand, and he touches the scar on this woman's hand, and all the grief that he never felt for his lost father comes pouring back. And the version of that too gets into Leopoldstadt. The stepfather, who turned out to be a rather blimpish, xenophobic, anti-Semitic character, and a bit of a bully from the sound of it, I think he put up with him, was aware that Major Stoppard didn't much like his bohemian artistic playwriting son, got out of home as soon as he could, partly because he just wanted to get off and not do A-levels and not go to university and go off to Bristol and be a journalist, but I think partly to get away. But he's absolutely devoted to his mother, and she to him, and she's the heroine of the book for me, actually. This extraordinary business of losing everything, losing your country and your husband and your home and your family, and fending for yourself and getting your boys to safety, and then setting up this armor around her whereby she wouldn't look back, and she was going to just make sure that life was as good for them as it could be. That's a heroic story.
It's definitely interesting to me that given his views about his stepfather and his mother, that he would have chosen to idolize Englishness, which was sort of everything that Kenneth Stoppard stood for, rather than having, I guess, been a little more curious about his roots at that early age. But it sounds like it was because he didn't want to upset his mother. The sort of relationship was precious to him.
We're talking very seriously about him. We mustn't forget that he's also a comic writer, and there's considerable comedy at the expense of Englishness all through the work. And an early play that he doesn't much like, called Enter a Free Man, has a sort of hopeless, blimpish, platitudinous character who's always making remarks about, good old England and so on, who's clearly somewhat based on Ken Stoppard, I would think. And, George the philosopher in Jumpers is a sort of wonderful travesty, if you like, of academic absent-mindedness in the English in the English mode. And there are many spoofs and satires on English behaviour and English eccentricity, but they come out of affection on the whole, I think.
I'd love to sort of think about his influences and the way he started, and how that childhood, sort of how the child became the playwright, because the way you describe it, it was not a sort of very bookish upbringing. He was trying to scrabble around to find books when he could. He didn't like Shakespeare at the beginning. It took him a long time to like Shakespeare, until he saw Peter O'Toole, essentially. It's almost unbelievable to think that child who was not, particularly fond of reading, and who preferred film, who didn't like Shakespeare, could become the writer of Arcadia and Rosencrantz.
Yeah, I think I may have given the wrong impression in that case. I think I need to back up on that slightly, in that he did like reading. There just weren't many books around the house. And there's a funny story about when he's about 9, or even earlier possibly, he picks up a copy of Swallows and Amazons, and reads it, and he sees that it's one of several books. So he tries to find another one by dint of going around and picking up all the books in the house to see if they are Swallows and Amazons, or another book by Arthur Ransom. It's very sweet. But he and his mother wanted to open a bookshop together in Darjeeling, and so, and although he didn't take to Shakespeare much at school, he says he was a very embarrassing Jessica in a reading of Merchant of Venice in one of their school lessons, which is very funny. He was certainly reading from, lapping it up from quite early on at school. So he would acquire sort of Evelyn Waugh, and quite early on. And then when he left school at 17 and went to Bristol, it was his university, really. He was taking everything in. He was a reporting journalist, but he was also writing film reviews and theatre reviews. And as you say, he fell in love with Peter O'Toole at the Bristol Old Vic, which was where he cut his theatrical teeth. And he used to rush back from work every night while Peter O'Toole was playing Hamlet, to see if he could catch him doing "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I."
How much of an impact do you think that time in Bristol, with particularly the Bristol Old Vic, being amongst those actors, how much of an impact do you think that had on him? Particularly, I guess, when he said, very young, he said, "I want to be famous," like that.
Huge, absolutely huge. I think Bristol is, and he says this often himself, Bristol was absolutely crucial in creating this person who wanted to turn his hand to every possible form of writing. He wanted there to be nothing he couldn't do. He also did want to be famous. He was very ambitious. And at that time in this country, in the late 50s, early 60s, if you wanted to really make your mark as a writer, the theatre was where you would naturally think of going. He did write a novel, which is perhaps deservedly forgotten, which came out in the same week that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern was put on. He thought the novel was going to be a great success and the play was going to be a flop. But it turned out not to be so. But yes, I think Bristol was absolutely crucial.
Yeah, yeah. And then if we think of his relationships, because of course he was someone who lived that life under the camera lens as well. For once he'd had this overnight success, and I think you really show in your book how it really was this overnight success, and to an extent that was the demise of his first marriage. How difficult was it writing about those relationships? You've touched on it a little bit. A lot of them, well, two of them which broke down, marriages that ended. When you're the biographer of the subject, how difficult is it to try and tell that story from both perspectives?
Yeah, it didn't seem to me difficult, actually, in that Josie, his first wife and the mother of his two older sons, was long dead, and that it had been a very difficult and unhappy early first marriage, as it turned out. And he talked to me very freely about that, as did Josie's sons, as did other people who'd known them then. So I felt that I was able to represent it as it happened. I also had the very good fortune to talk quite a lot to Miriam Stoppard, um, who, together they had this astonishing life, bringing up the four, her two sons and Josie's two sons together in a great big house near Maidenhead, and Miriam Stoppard's work, which as a health guru and a child advisor on how to bring up children, and a television and a doctor and a pharmacist. She was firing on all cylinders, just as he was. And they had an extraordinary, I mean, they were both, Miriam Stoppard was more famous than Tom Stoppard for quite a time. And they had a big, massively active domestic and public and professional and social life. And then in his later years, uh, the two long relationships that he had after that were both with people who he worked with, and they came very much out of working on plays with these two actors, and his present wife Sabrina has been incredibly helpful and generous and friendly about telling her bit of the story. So it hasn't been um, an obstacle race for me at all.
If we look at the work and we think about the texts and the work and the plays after that sort of incredible overnight success of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in 67, then came all the criticism, then came all the sort of the literary criticism written about it. And something he has always resisted is being overread. Audiences pore over the meanings in his plays, and you had this lovely line that he talks of feeling like a duped smuggler. Critics find complex ideas in what he's written. Why do you think it is that he resists that over analysis? It almost feels like he's trying to say, no, don't find things that are in there, that don't find it too deep. It's not.
Yes,
you think.
it's a very funny image that you've referred to there, where he's like a man at customs and being asked if he packed his own suitcase, and he said yes, and they said, have you got the following things, existentialism, surrealism? He said, no, I haven't got any of those. And then they open the suitcase and apparently they're all there. I'm slightly misquoting, but that's a general gist. Yes, I think he wants to, certainly for many, many years, I think he primarily wanted to be thought of as an entertainer, as a person who wrote plays that would attract people to the theatre, and they would stay in the theatre and not leave the theatre until the play had finished. And there's nothing more depressing to him than the sound of a seat banging as somebody leaves halfway through a play because they don't understand it, or and although his plays are notoriously complicated and difficult sometimes, and you quite often start a Stoppard play in a state of suspended bewilderment, as at the beginning of travesties, for instance, where somebody's speaking Russian, somebody else is dictating a surrealist text, and somebody else is writing, high modernist Joycean prose. So you don't know who, you don't understand any of these three languages at the beginning of the play. You have to kind of stay and watch the play or read the play to get what's going on. So he does puzzle and bewilder and excite and ambush his audiences, but he also wants them to get it. And he wants them to laugh, and he wants them to cry, and he wants them to stay with it. And I think there's nothing worse for him than somebody saying, in order to go and see The Coast of Utopia, you need to read the following 12 books about Russian history and Russian philosophy. I mean, one of the critics actually did that. And Stoppard sort of intervened and said, for God's sake, no, you just need to come see the play and follow the story and you'll be there.
That's very interesting, because I would say that you probably do need to have a vague understanding of Hamlet in order to understand Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but I
Yes.
would resist that.
It's funny that because I went to see I went to see the rehearsals of, and I went to see some of the productions of David Laveau's wonderful 50th anniversary production of Rosencrantz with Daniel Radcliffe, and it must be said that there were quite a few people in the audience who were there because it was Daniel Radcliffe, and they clearly didn't know anything about Stoppard, and they clearly didn't know anything about Hamlet, and there was a slight air of bemusement in the early bits of the play amongst that bit of the audience. You could actually see them sort of thinking, what is this? And actually what happened was that they sort of, the people who'd come not because of Stoppard or because of Hamlet, but because of Harry Potter, kind of began to get really involved. So the play set out their own terms. Once you enter into it and go with it and trust yourself for the ride, you'll miss some things. Nobody gets the whole of every line of a Stoppard play, or probably any play, come to that. But I think most people will go with the flow.
Yeah, and there's certainly a joy because it's so quick. The repartee is so quick.
Yes, yes, like
there
a game.
Joy in sort of when you can congratulate yourself on having understood one part of it. It's wonderful.
Well, he says laughter is the sound of self-congratulation.
It's absolutely, certainly in my experience. There's a sense as well with Stoppard, the Stoppard that you write of, that he throws himself into this research. For someone who, we're constantly reminded, didn't go to university, but he throws himself into research about the most diverse subjects. So it can be mathematical theorems, philosophy. I mean, you talk about Dadaism, historical, psychological, all sorts. And then you write almost of this point where he's not quite sure for quite a lot of his career when to stop researching and actually just start writing. And that's a difficult moment for him, thinking, I've got enough now, I can start putting words on the page.
The good example of that was a wonderful play called The Invention of Love, which is about the poet A. Housman. It's one of those plays of his which is like a sort of fictional biography, where there are two Housmans, the old Housman and the young Housman, and there are two kinds of Housman. There's the thwarted romantic poet who writes these beautiful love poems, and there is the dry as dust classical scholar who edits and annotates Latin poetry, and in order to write about Housman, Stoppard took a sort of crash course in classical poetry and indeed in translation, and joined a group which was dedicated to translating Horace and things like this. And he'd been very good at it at school, actually. He said that doing Greek and Latin for him was like doing Lego. He really liked it. He liked sort of fitting the bits together. And you can see him doing that actually in the play, which is a lot about translation. And he often says of that play that he went on reading for 5 years before he started writing this play, because he was enjoying the research so much. So it's partly loving it, and it's partly, as you say, often having built up an enormous amount of material on quantum physics or chaos theory, and then having to knuckle down and turn it into a plot. And sometimes I think it works better than others. I mean, I find Hapgood, the Cold War play about the twins and the double plot, and which has a lot of quantum physics in it. I find it incredibly difficult. It was by far the hardest play to write about. And I think even when I saw it, I didn't truly quite get all of it.
I wonder if you think in that sort of hesitation between when is the moment to stop researching, there's I wonder if you think it's an insecurity of, oh God, no, I have to be I have to be the world leader on all this research before I can start writing a play on it. Or do you think it's something else do you think, as you said, it's perhaps just the enjoyment of the process that stops him?
I think it's the enjoyment of the process, and I think it's wanting not to get things wrong, so that he needs to be completely master of the subject, so that when he is writing about entropy or algorithms in Arcadia, or when he's writing about chaos theory in that play, he needs to know exactly how to make this work as a drama through dramatic speech, because if he's not in charge of it at that point, it's not going to work. And you see that interestingly in a more recent play called The Hard Problem, where he became, and has for a long time, been very interested in theories of consciousness and the whole question of what is the mind and what is the brain, and is there anything in us outside the material, structure of the brain. And he has two main characters, Hilary and Spike, arguing that case back and forth. And of course, Spike, who's the materialist, gets a lot of the best lines, though you can see that the author is on the side of Hilary, who thinks there are things outside the material, matter of the brain. And that there might be a possibility for something like prayer, for instance, although it's not an explicitly religious play, but it gets close to it. And in order for us to understand what's going on in those debates about consciousness, Stoppard's got to kind of master that. Yeah.
Now, I'm conscious of time. There's something I definitely absolutely wanted to ask you, which was, you, during the course of writing the book or the research, you found out, I think, what Stoppard's favourite play of his was, but it wasn't the same as what he thought his best play was. And when I think you found that out, I'm not sure whether it came before Leopoldstadt had opened or not, but I wonder, if you could talk about those two, but also whether you could say whether you think it would have changed after Leopoldstadt.
I don't know, I haven't asked him, but he says his favourite play is The Invention of Love, which is also one of my favourite of Stoppard's plays, actually, simply because of the pleasure, as I've been describing it, that he took in writing it. And it's a very beautiful and romantic and interesting play, I think. It's a very sad play. And he thinks that Arcadia, as many people think, is a sort of perfect play. And then when he said that, he immediately retracted it and said, well, this is ridiculous to talk about a perfect play. But he said, but it just fell out like a game of patience, is what he said to me, actually.
That's fascinating. And I'd love to know down the line. I wonder actually if you'll continue, now that the work is over, is the work of a biographer finished? Of course, your contract has come to an end, but do you think that this work lives on beyond? And I don't know if you've had discussions about whether down the line something more could be added, and whether you could talk about
yeah, I see what you mean. Some more extra chapters. Well, we'll have to see.
Very coy. Now, I'm conscious of time. You've been incredibly generous with your time. I want to apologise for viewers, because for some reason my Q&A function is not working. So if there are past questions, I'm terribly sorry, but I've not been able to see them. So if there are, I'm sure that the team at the How To Academy will be able to field some of those, and we'll work out how to deal with that afterwards. So I do apologise on that behalf. But it leaves me to thank Hermione so much for your time. I mean, it is a prodigious book. It's enormous. It's extraordinarily detailed. It's beautifully written. And I certainly finished the book feeling in awe of the biographer's craft, just as I was in awe of the playwright.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for this really interesting conversation and for all your great questions. Thanks a lot.